It's commonly accepted among the video game community that Super Mario Bros. Has fun physics. They're cited as one of the biggest reasons the game was successful. But while the game's physics are widely praised, I haven't seen much analysis as to why the physics and sense of movement are fun. And that's exactly what this video will be about.
Just to introduce myself, I've been playing Mario games for a long time and am the sole creator of the ROM hack, SMB, just 6 levels. You can find a link to the patch in the description.
Word of warning, since I'll be talking about the physics of this game, some of the explanations on movement will be a little bit dry. But before I talk about the physics, I'd like to start with a few general points about movement in the game as a whole. There's a lot to be said about innovations the game made at the time of its release, as it did a lot of things not many of its contemporaries did. Some of the most important of those innovations were having dynamic jumping instead of the more static binary jumps that most games had, having smooth screen scrolling from left to right, a large number of environments, and an ending that could be reasonably reached. But for this video, I'll be talking about why the feel of the game is still fun today, rather than talking about what it did that was new at the time. Repositioning your character in order to attack an enemy is very, very common in video games. In platformers especially, jumping is a common way to reposition your character. But while other games have you repositioned by jumping so that you can attack by some other means, in Super Mario Bros., your main method of attack is repositioning your character. This helps keep an emphasis on movement, although other, less direct methods of attack do exist and help to add some variety. Level design is obviously a big part of what makes movement in any game fun, but I'll mostly be focusing on the movement systems rather than analyzing the game's level design. However, one point that is worth making about level design is that a lot of areas use obstacles to stop your momentum or sense of flow instead of using obstacles to threaten you with damage. These are more forgiving than hazards that damage the player, and areas like this affect the player's sense of pacing in a different way than enemies do, especially since, unlike most other games, Super Mario Bros. Doesn't have damage knockback, and getting hit doesn't really affect your momentum. There's a massive amount of arcade influence in Super Mario Bros. You can't save your progress and have to start over every time you play the game. While a lot of games are made with replayability in mind, it's important not to underestimate just how core of a design element replayability becomes when the player is unable to save any progress. With only 3 lives at the start and the extras you earn, you're clearly intended to start all the way over at least a few times before you're able to beat the game. The inability to go backwards isn't just there to tell the player they have to keep moving forward, it's also there to stop the player from exploring a level too thoroughly. If you missed something, you missed it. Get it next time. The timer also plays an important role in replayability. While its most obvious function is to threaten the player and ensure they're always moving, it also prevents someone from taking their time and destroying every block in a level. Without a timer, there would be nothing to discourage players from finding every secret item on their first run. Replayability and non-linearity go hand in hand. The most obvious examples of non-linearity are the shortcuts to later levels, and these are a good example of macro non-linearity. Hidden bonus rooms also tend to exit you later in the level than where you entered them, and are effectively an alternate route through a level. Take these alternate bonus routes into account along with the inability to go backwards, and it's often impossible for a player to see everything in a level if they only go through that level once. There are some levels with more than one bonus room, which require even more playthroughs if you want to see everything. There are even 2 levels, World 5-2 and World 6-2, that have hidden underwater levels inside of them. These underwater sections aren't just bonus rooms, they're each an alternate route that changes about half the level. I realize I'm starting to sound a little bit off topic, but all of these elements affect the sense of progression throughout the game, which does affect the player's perception of moment-to-moment movement. As an early home video game, one of the goals of Super Mario Bros. Was to bring the arcade experience home, and the arcade experience is very different from most console games today. Perhaps the most important of the nonlinear elements are the various rows of blocks. These often form unique pathways you can jump in and out of, which gives you a lot of options at each given moment. These provide a great deal of micro nonlinearity for the game, but I'll get back to these later. Everything besides reaching the end of the level alive is optional. You don't need to kill enemies, collect coins or items, or look for secrets unless you want to, or think you need to in order to survive to the end. When people talk about the physics of Super Mario Bros., they're usually talking about the sense of player movement. While the physics are a major part of why moving around in the game is fun, they aren't the whole story. There are a lot of core game elements that influence the pacing of the movement, often in a way the player isn't directly conscious of. These unconscious cues are just as important as the movement physics when it comes to creating a unique sense of play. I'll be talking about the basic movement systems and how those systems create a sense of speed and weight. But to understand what makes movement fun, we also have to look at the psychological tricks the game uses to subconsciously influence the player. But for now, let's focus on the physics. The game runs at a smooth 60 frames per second, which is still considered the optimal FPS today. Before I go on, I'd like to give a shout out to JDaster64 for disassembling the game's code and translating it into terms understandable to the average person. I also have to give big thanks to Doppelganger for his work on documenting the code of Super Mario Bros. The game uses 5 units of measurement for almost all of its calculations. These units are blocks, which are the size of one in-game block, pixels, which are a 16th the size of one block, subpixels, which are a 16th the size of a pixel, sub-subpixels, which are a 16th the size of a subpixel, and sub-subpixels, which are a 16th the size of one sub-subpixel. The game calculates position down to the subpixel level, while sub-subpixels and sub-sub-subpixels don't directly determine Mario's position and are mostly used to precisely calculate acceleration values. Calculations for position are accurate to a 16th of a pixel, and calculations for acceleration are precise enough to be accurate to a 16th of a 16th of a 16th of a pixel, or 1/4096th of a pixel. If the game only used pixel or even just subpixel values when calculating acceleration, the sense of movement would have felt much less dynamic, because there would have been a range of far fewer possible values. There are a number of benefits to tracking below pixel level values. For one, subpixels allow players to inch along less than 1 pixel at a time. While that might not seem like a big deal, this level of precision means a careful player won't accidentally step ahead farther than they mean to, avoiding a common frustration with platforming games. It also provides a very precise sense or feeling of movement. You see Mario take a little step, but he doesn't visibly move forward on screen. This helps to condition players to make decisions based on their sense of the game's movement, rather than relying on visual cues, and actively gets the player to visualize the tiny places too small to render on screen. Before continuing, I should clear up some things about the hexadecimal system. In hex, the numbers 1 through 15 are represented as 1 through F, with the letters A through F replacing the numbers 10 through 15. Once you go past F, then you add a digit to the front and get what looks like 10, but actually represents 16. Also, for brevity's sake, I'm going to refer to subpixels as SPs, sub-subpixels as SSPs, and sub-sub-subpixels as SSSPs. For blocks, pixels, and lower values, each is tracked as the next digit of the previous. If you exceed FSPs by, let's say, 5 SPs, you would be moving at 01400 per frame, or 1 pixel and 4 subpixels per frame. To clarify SSP and SSSP effects a bit more, a speed value of 000XX won't move Mario at all. These values are there to determine with more precision the rate at which SP and higher values increase while moving. So while they don't directly change Mario's position, they do hold an abstract value sort of representing a position. Keep in mind that because distances are covered based on what individual integers are within the whole number, rather than taking the number as a single, number, the overall sense of movement in the game is a bit of a unique one. At least it is today. Many games around this time handled movement in a similar way. With all that explained, we can start talking about ground movement. Holding left or right gives you an acceleration of 98 per frame. The minimum value needed to enter the walking rate is 130, double 98 in hex. This means you start moving on the second frame, which is pretty snappy movement. The maximum walking speed is 1900, meaning it takes roughly 0.66 seconds to reach max walking speed once you start moving. At first I thought both these values were incorrect because they seemed too fast. But you actually do reach a speed of roughly 6 blocks per second in less than a second of walking acceleration. Part of why this seems faster than expected is probably due to each counter on the timer not being a second, but being 0.4 seconds. This affects the player's own sense of time and makes quick actions seem to stretch out over a longer period of time than they actually do. There are two types of deceleration. One is when you just let go of the direction you are holding, which basically just lets you coast to a stop in what could be considered a neutral gear. This decelerates at a rate of d0 per frame. You decelerate faster in neutral than you accelerate while walking. The second type of deceleration is when you press the opposite direction you are moving. This has a deceleration rate of 1a0, double the other type of deceleration, and a greater rate than walking or running. The takeaway here is that it's easier to slow down than it is to speed up. One weird quirk about crouching is that while crouching, you always decelerate at the slower, neutral rate, regardless of whatever direction you may or may not be holding. In addition to shrinking your hitbox, crouching can affect jumps. It makes you decelerate for a brief moment before the jump begins, which, depending on speed and how many frames there are between crouching and jumping, can actually make a big difference in your jump's trajectory. Because air neutral is different from ground neutral, there is no drag in the air caused by crouching, so you don't decelerate. Unfortunately, you can't really speed up while crouching in the air either. When you have the run button and a direction held down, you have an acceleration rate of e4 per frame, 1.5 times faster than walking acceleration. The maximum run speed is 2,900, 1.64 times faster than max walking speed. If you release the B button, you'll continue to be in the running state for 10 frames, or a sixth of a second, and then slow instantly to the max walking speed. Now that I'm aware of this, I'm surprised the transition from running to walking never felt jarring, like controls often do when you immediately drop a speed value instead of smoothly scaling down over time. I believe the only reason this isn't jarring for most players is because the maximum walking speed is still pretty fast. And while I wouldn't call it jarring, it is certainly a noticeable drop in speed once you know it's there. This results in an aspect of the game that prioritizes responsiveness to player input over accurately simulating physics. If you want to go from running speed to walking, you can do so near instantly. This also affects the game feel for most players when they have the Fire Flower, but I'll get to that later. Another key difference for Super Mario Bros. Is that acceleration rate is determined by holding down a button that alters your sense of movement. In many other games, this button would just be an attack, and in most games that use analog sticks, while those sticks give you a larger potential range of movement to choose from, they often set the character to move at a certain speed instead of to accelerate at a certain rate. Treating acceleration the way Super Mario Bros. Does results in a feeling that isn't too different from switching between gears in a car with your foot on the gas pedal. Using your controller to select an acceleration rather than to select a static speed also results in a playstyle that causes you to continually release and repress a button in order to control speed. This type of twitchy, constantly involved gameplay helps to maintain player attention, and helps to maintain a feeling of constant activity. This sense of activity goes a long way toward building the relationship between the player character and the player's own sense of movement, because it takes advantage of the player's actual movements. Many games, such as fighting games, attempt to do something similar to keep players actively engaged, but many of these games attempt this by having complex, difficult controls, while the twitchiness of Super Mario Bros. Is quite intuitive and easy to understand. That about does it for ground physics, so now I'd like to focus on elements of design for a bit. It should be obvious that being able to take a hit without dying will cause many players to run faster than they would as Small Mario, but there are other ways items affect player movement. Being able to break bricks opens up a large amount of movement options, which increases the micro nonlinearity a ton. As Small Mario, the points where you can switch between different layers are left to the mercy of the level designers. You don't have the option to move up and down layers except for where the game allows you to. But as Super Mario, you no longer just control Mario. You control the level itself, and can redesign it as you play to suit your needs. Generally speaking, staying higher is safer. There are also some secrets and areas you can only reach as Super Mario, and the act of jumping from one row of bricks to another without falling below the upper screen adds a nice optional micro challenge that doesn't have much consequence, somewhat similar to roadblock obstacles that don't damage you. The most obvious place to skip the lower, more dangerous areas is in Stage 1-2, but higher, more separated rows of blocks in other stages provide a similar experience, even if they're less obvious about it. The game never tells you explicitly to traverse levels this way, and not everyone will all of the time. You can also miss out on collecting a lot of items this way. However, having different rows of blocks on screen at different heights literally adds extra layers to the gameplay, and means you can go through the same exact part of one level differently than you did last time. The ability to redesign a level on the fly can also affect how enemies behave, since a lot of them are affected by blocks. There can be negative consequences to destroying bricks. Some items can only be grabbed if you leave certain bricks unbroken, which adds an extra layer to exploration and secrets, and further emphasizes the game's replayable nature and the frivolousness of a single playthrough, while also adding weight to the consequences of your actions. You have to navigate some areas differently when big, which can outright require remaking the level. This can let the player feel clever, powerful, and skilled. Other times, sliding is all it takes. All in all, super mushrooms expand your options a ton in addition to making you safer. The ease of being able to go through instead of around bricks shouldn't be understated, especially where you are rewarded for it. If you could never break blocks, or if you could always break blocks even as Small Mario, the game would be a lot more monotone in its playstyle. Tying this ability to the same upgrade that lets you take a hit dramatically changes the movement by adding so much more versatility to the jump move, helps replayability since it changes how you'll play through any given part of a level, and also adds a lot more value to the item than it would have if it was just a health upgrade. As Fire Mario, you can usually just hold down the run button, and only need to let go of it when you want to throw a fireball. If you're fast enough, you can do this without losing any speed, but because of how quick you need to be, most players will often slow down a little. This almost completely eliminates enemies as a threat. Almost. So you usually only have to worry about falling into pits, or touching fire if you're in a castle. Players generally move much faster as Fire Mario, because they only need to let go of the run button long enough to press it again. It comes with all of the perks of Super Mario, which means the Fire Flower is always an upgrade, and never a trade-off. The fireballs themselves are like toys. They move more like bouncy balls than bullets. They move at very specific trajectory, one not seen in very many 2D games, where your attacks are usually either a close range hit or a projectile that moves in a plain horizontal line. They can even bounce over Goombas and Spinies, so your positioning when you throw a fireball matters a little bit. Their bouncy nature means that they are very affected by stage design, and how useful a power-up is will change at different points in a single stage. This is especially true in areas with lots of walls. Just like everything else in the game, fireballs are constrained by a set of rules governing their interaction with other objects. Being so dependent on stage objects and being affected by gravity gives them a sense of physical realness. They are affected not only by the stage design, but also how the player remakes the stage. Fire is also the only way you can attack enemies underwater, which changes water levels into a sort of shoot-'em-up arcade game instead of having to avoid everything. These levels also provide examples of being able to destroy otherwise indestructible enemies with fire, which is another perk that affects how players progress. While the Fire Flower's usefulness varies, it does change the way players think about and engage with different parts of the level. The majority of the time, it leads to the player running through a level much faster than they normally would. The increase in speed at which most players move helps keep the game exciting in spite of the loss in tension you get from powering up. The Starman power-up only lasts for a limited time, so players keep the run button held the entire time in order to maximize the distance gained during this brief period. It's the power-up that results in players moving the fastest. It's also the safest state to be in, since you cannot take damage, and can only die from pits or a timeout. This incentivizes moving as quickly as possible, as does the fast tempo of the Star theme. Ironically, this can lead to a lot of players falling into a pit and getting themselves killed precisely because they are invincible. But the impetus for this is entirely on the player, and whatever outcome is entirely due to their own actions. Not an item state, but a state nonetheless, Small Mario is always just one touch away from death, which is its own kind of adrenaline, different from speed. Running as Small Mario might just be the most stress-inducing state to be in. Because each power-up affects how players will move, you can go through the same area in completely different ways depending on which power-up you have. This helps replayability immensely, and what's even better is that the item state you are in during any given point of a level is due to your own actions and mistakes. Impetus of reward and punishment is on the player to do well, and the form that reward and punishment takes is one that, often unconsciously, affects almost every aspect of movement, without ever changing the feeling of movement that the player is familiar with. This is because, unlike power-ups in other games, none of these power-ups affect your movement directly. The changes in how Mario moves are all due to the player reacting to different situations. The focus of the design is not on the game itself, but on the choices of the player, and what they want to do with the options they have earned. This is not to say I think power-ups that directly change movement are bad. I really like a lot of power-ups that work that way. But I think there's something a bit subtler and a bit more nuanced in the way items change your movement in Super Mario Bros. Also of note is that mushrooms move while flowers don't, so the way you interact with the two items is actually different. Chasing an item happens frequently, especially with stars, which have their own unique movement as well. There are certain areas that reward you for holding on to the mushroom state with an item you can only reach while super, while there are others that will give you a mushroom out of pity if you're small, but will release a flower you can't reach if you're already super. Or if you can reach it, it might just take more skill to grab than a mushroom would have. One more thing before I get back to physics is that you are never more than 2 mistakes away from death. Often, 1 mistake is all it takes, even while powered up or invincible. Fire and Super Mario both turn into Small Mario when hit, despite Fire being a better state than Super. So in a way, getting hit as Fire Mario feels more punishing since it's a greater loss, even if you end up in the same state. This helps the Fire Mario stage retain at least some sense of risk that is otherwise lost when powering up. This is just one example of how Super Mario Bros. In general is a lot more punishing than later games in the series, and doesn't offer as many corrections for mistakes. This helps to retain a sense of risk and danger, which makes the game as a whole more exciting. A palpable sense of risk also makes it feel just a little bit more like an actual adventure.